what we're going to do is we're going to... Oh, that's okay. Today we're going to explore the barriers and the challenges faced by women's leadership, North and South. And also we're going to talk about the significantly changed political, social and economic environment, both globally and on this island, that really impacts on women's leadership. We're going to look at what leadership means in the context of a divided island. And we're going to consider how we can and how we are rising to these challenges, and how we can reshape decision-making and leadership spaces to reflect feminist values, principles and approaches. So, as you will know, the National Women's Council, we're the leading national organisation representing women's groups across the island, and there's nearly 200 member groups. And this issue of women's leadership is really core to our goals in the Women's Council and core to achieving women's equality. We know we have to have women in all of the key decision-making spaces in order to bring about the change that we want. But we also know we need to really support and value the leadership that's happening in all of our communities on a daily basis by women, and who are really at the coalface in terms of some of the, I think, critical changes right now at the moment in society. In terms of the political space, women have historically faced significant barriers to political representation, and many of those persist today. I think we're probably familiar with what was called the 5 C's, this issue of, cash, confidence, culture, candidate selection, and also support for care. And there's been a sixth now added to that, and that's emerging from cyber abuse and the cyber abuse that women experience who are in public life. And in particular, when we're talking about leadership, we also include a strong intersectional approach in terms of traveller and Roma women, working class women, lone parents, disabled women, migrant women, women of colour, women in rural communities who face additional barriers in terms of that political representation. So we know we have to do much more in terms of making political institutions accessible and supportive. And also we need to change the structures in which those institutions operate. I think one of the key things, and I know we'll be hearing more about it today, is we talk about the triple shift that women have of paid work, of caregiving, and then of participation, be it in work or be it in politics. We know as well the candidate selection, party culture is very male dominated and still really based very much in those patriarchal norms. And also, as I've mentioned in terms of cyber abuse, the increasing online abuse and violence that women experience is becoming more documented, and the challenges that presents, particularly for people who are entering into the political space, but also leadership in many other aspects of our society. In our work with young women in the National Women's Council, this is one of the areas that they really talk about in terms of it being, a factor of not going forward for positions, and whether that's in students' unions or in politics or in community groups. So, and I think that speaks to an issue that we will be talking about today, is the environment in which women's leadership, the environment in which we are trying to bring about change and in which we're having this conversation on women's leadership has really radically altered. The backlash to women's rights, the undermining of the value of equality and anti-discrimination, the creep of far-right ideology and practice into mainstream thinking and government action on all sides of the island, east and west as well, is detrimental to women's rights and equality. And I think this is very visible as the space for women's organisations to campaign and to mobilise becomes more contested. And we've spoken about this in the forum, where funding to women's organisations is often more focused now on the services that they provide rather than the change they are trying to bring about in their communities. And we've spoken a lot about the environment in the north in terms of the undermining of civil society through cutbacks to funding. And we've seen it particularly in the area of violence against women. So investment in women's leadership is key in all sectors of society, because it's women who are at the centre of organising to stem the tide of the far right, of racism and of misogyny. So this will be an important discussion today. It's going to be important as well for the forum in terms of looking at what can we do. It's also about showing solidarity with women's groups across the island, and also, to highlight the challenges, but but to figure out how can we organise, how can we mobilise against some of the changes that are happening. We believe very much in the Forum and in the National Women's Council that bold feminist intersectional leadership is needed to address the challenges that are faced north and south. We need to recognise how different forms of oppression intersect across gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, and ensuring that really diverse voices are heard and valued in decision making is absolutely crucial, so that the decisions that we make, whether we make them in the Forum or whether they're made in politics, are inclusive of women, particularly those who are most marginalised. So we're going to begin today with a presentation from Dr. Pauline Cullen, and I'll introduce Pauline in a moment. And then that's going to be followed by a panel on women's leadership, and it's a really exciting panel. And I'll be introducing the people who will be a part of that, but we're really appreciative of people because, yeah, there's a brilliant group, and I think it'll be an exciting discussion. And then the discussion will be followed by then a session of forum members who are going to explore more about what we've spoken about today. And also as well in the afternoon, we'll be talking about the evaluation of the forum, which is work being undertaken by the Social Change Initiative. So that's the outline for the day. So I'm now going to invite Professor Pauline Cullen to start, to give her address. And for those of you who don't know, Professor Pauline Cullen is in sociology in the Department of Sociology at Maynooth University. And Pauline's work has examined civil society, feminist analysis of politics and policy, including, I think, the full range of inequalities women experience in representation and also care. She's a gender expert for the Commission of the European Union and the European Institute of Gender Equality. And I have to say, for a long time, Pauline has really been at the fore in terms of really pushing forward the issues around the barriers and the challenges to women's representation. So we're delighted to have Professor Cullen here with us today. Over to you, Pauline.
Thank you and good morning. It's a real privilege to be in this room with these women, I have to say, and to have been asked by the Women's Council to give this short talk this morning. So I really want to acknowledge that there's so much expertise and experience in this room already about the lived realities of trying to push forward the feminist agenda in difficult spaces. I'm just going to offer some reflection on some of the research I've done and some of the collaborations I have with colleagues, particularly in the continent and in North America, around trying to think about feminist leadership. So I have been asked to think about what a truly feminist style of politics would look like. And for many of us, including what Orla has just said, this is about advancing intersectional democratic futures. And what we know about the situation on the ground is pretty grim. While we can say there's been progress in Northern Ireland, we have 40% MLAs are women. 2025, 7 of the 12 Northern Ireland executive ministers are female. 26% of local councillors and 18% of mayors or council chairs are women. In Ireland, we have, 45% of women in the Seanad, but yet less progress is evident with women really quite minor in terms of their presence, particularly in parliamentary contexts in the Dáil and also in local assemblies in the Republic. In both contexts, minoritized women are largely absent. And we know we had the first Black politician elected to any public office here in the north, Lillian Sansome Barr. And in the south, we have one singular senator from the Traveller community, Eileen Flynn. Now, we had 11 women of migrant background elected in the local elections in Ireland last year. But certainly, we know we have a lot of progress to make. This underrepresentation is a result of persistent systemic barriers, and Orla has outlined some of them already, and they hinder women's ability to lead. While women dominate the community and voluntary sector and civil society, and they do essential work to maintain communities that is often, as we know, unrecognised, this work has been decimated, as we've heard, across the island by austerity that reduce budgets and perpetuate insecure and low-paid work for many women in that sector. The loss of EU funding to civil society organisations in Northern Ireland obviously has negatively impacted some of the most marginalised groups, including women who work in that sector. While the links are contingent between having women's bodies in political office and policies that reflect their interests, we see the results of gender-blind policymaking everywhere. Broader gender implications of austerity and the cost of living crisis are well known to everybody in this room. ESRI research recently looked at the gaps between North and South around household disposable income, with data from 2018 registering an 18.3% gap between North and South, which has widened over time. But it is a complex picture. We have more women in low-paid work in the South, even though the labour force participation rates for women are higher in the South than in the North, and we know there is higher pay inequality in Ireland in the South. The ESRI Shared Island report also found that child income poverty rates are higher in Northern Ireland, partly as a result, obviously, of the child-related benefit cuts, while child material deprivation is somewhat higher in Ireland. Research by the House of Commons Library found that 86% of the savings to the Treasury through tax and benefit changes since 2010 will have come from women. So we know the cost of living crisis is now compounding and worsening the situation, lower income especially, as already referenced, for lone parent households. Care provision on both sides of the border is very poor. Violence against women is also endemic in both jurisdictions, illustrated in the appalling increase in those making contact, as well as the rates of femicide and familicide. There is also an uptick in racist hate crimes in both jurisdictions. Now, feminist scholars, particularly those working on Northern Irish society, people like Fidelma Ash, Jennifer Todd, Joanne McAvoy and others, have looked at these issues in the context of the North and South border dynamics. And they've emphasised how the gendered and sexist visions of the nation continue today to impact on women's lives. And people in this room, I know, have been part of that analysis, that in some quarters have argued for feminist constitutionalism, that includes recognition of women in all their diversity, and really places them not as background actors, as Claire Pearson would say, but in the foreground of these kinds of conversations and processes, as legitimate political actors. And this includes centering underreached groups that are further marginalised from important decision-making. Now, perspectives on this issue, of course, differs across the feminist community, particularly in terms of the research. Therese O'Keefe and her collaborators have drawn our attention to the unique experiences of women on the border, including migrant women that compound their marginalisation. And they do acknowledge progress made in Northern Ireland by feminist peace initiatives, crucial for gender equality. Some rich recent social histories of feminisms in the South and partly in the North, including from people like Jennifer Redmond, Mary McAuliffe, Linda Connolly and Evelyn Conlon, and others, also underline the complexity shaping the development of women's activism and feminist leadership. But a common thread across all of this work has been that looking back reveals the necessary compromises were made, particularly with feminists engaging with masculinist institutions, focusing on what are understood to be common issues, sometimes for pragmatic reasons. But this has resulted in the longer term, really, on leaving certain women behind and gaps in our capacity to deal with the evolving and dynamic reality that experienced particularly by minoritized women. Now, this includes at times relying on ideas about women as leaders and peacemakers that risk reducing their role to a set of fixed attributes rather than a broader focus on designing feminist, intersectional and anti-racist systems. This is evident in recent work with women in border communities that revealed extraordinary capacity of women to tell stories, and I know this was the experience of the Women's Assembly, about very difficult issues and make links to the bigger structures and processes, but revealed the unbelievable gulf between those realities and women holding their communities together and the decision-making and the debate and conversation on constitutional change with male elites working in what we call the big, large P politics space. So what we know, despite all of the research and the conversations that have been had about this, is that an understanding of the local and national histories, structures and institutions and the relations of power are crucial to be able to look at what is unjust and exclusionary and imagine emancipatory alternatives. And what's at stake? Well, I want to spend a few minutes reflecting on something that Orla referenced, and it really is exercising contemporary concerns of feminist politics. And that is thinking about anti-gender politics more broadly as setting a new context that not only underlines the old shortcomings and inequalities related to democracy and feminism, but has introduced new ones. And we are in a context of a global right-wing project of misinformation, disinformation, and then coupled with that, in bed with it, in fact, neoliberal disinvestment from the welfare state. All these elements are in an opportunistic, synergenic relationship, and they're combining together to exploit liberal norms and practices to ultimately undermine and dismantle democratic values. We know that contemporary right-wing projects increasingly use gender equality and human rights talk to maintain or re-establish masculine power. What we see is that gender gathers around it a number of collective fears and anxieties, which in turn justifies hate or even violence that includes race and ethnicity. Opposition to feminism is a consistent element across much of this. And it tends to be tied, as we know, with homophobia, xenophobia, and transphobia. We find it in the streets, we find it in neighbourhood WhatsApp groups, and we find it in the manosphere. But it is everywhere. These forces have hijacked victimhood to frame themselves as the casualties of a too inclusive public sphere, including civil society, and they instrumentalise, we know, issues such as violence against women and children's rights to gain support. The implications of all of this are that women continue to be misrepresented, and gender equality is stagnating or backsliding. And despite an increased presence of women in formal politics, this is the case. A lot of the anxiety around this, sadly, doesn't confront democracy's existing internal problems. They remain largely unexamined by many commentators on this. So I think any conversation about feminist democratic futures has to be honest about the failures of liberal democracies, always to fully include and live up to their espoused values for everyone. Now, I want to make reference to some work done in a number of EU-funded projects that I have a relationship with that have been funded to think about the feminist response to anti-democratic forces across Europe. And I'm thinking about work done particularly by colleagues Joanne Sansome and Emma Lombardo in a project called Kindle. It's one of a few of them that are looking at how feminists have developed approaches to reimagining feminist leadership in the context of the kinds of threats I've just outlined. One of the initiatives that they've developed are feminist democracy labs. And these are social and research-oriented activities aimed at creating transnational peer learning communities where feminist actors engage in participatory dialogues and co-create and actively promote feminist democracy. A recent lab was held around the European Parliament in Brussels. It brought activists and politicians together to unpack what has gone wrong with the FEM Committee, the Women's Equality Committee in the Parliament, historically known as a context for feminist leadership, a place that we looked for support sometimes, not always perfect, but certainly support on gender equality issues, has been utterly compromised by a shift to the right within the committee and in the external context of the Parliament. And this Feminist Democracy Lab was an on-the-ground effort to share feminist and intersectional analysis and strategies. These projects have also developed an interactive atlas of what is happening across Europe on the ground in communities from feminist identified or anti-racist actors trying to think about creatively what they can do to respond to the different threats that they experienced. Some of them have particularly focused on looking at borders and border violence as part of this. They really centred that in their analysis. And the focus has also been on intergenerational feminist leadership, thinking about how to pass on and thinking about how to pull in younger people into these projects. Overall, these projects remind us that feminist politics democratises the state, and by claiming new rights for formerly excluded communities and issues. In addition, feminist politics democratises the public sphere by promoting inclusionary and participatory processes. The bottom line is that feminist politics performs a critical function for democracy by scrutinising power and holding the state accountable for gender equality commitments. Feminist leadership has value then because it moves us from the forms of thin democracy that we often experience to thicker and more inclusive practices and institutions. A lot of these projects identify broad goals of feminist leadership, and they include things like insisting on the right to space, speech, and critique as an overarching kind of set of goals for thinking about the kind of compass-oriented feminist accounts, with constant attention to the risk of erasures of marginalised communities. But what does it mean? For many, a lot of this talk about feminist democratic futures is about increasing the number of women in politics, especially in powerful positions, and it's about resourcing feminist civil society. But we still need to account for what we call good and bad representation, and ask which women are being represented, which women's claims are present. Does the process connect with women in society? Even when we increase women's bodies in parliaments and other spaces without an institutional obligation to represent groups, it is left up to individual representatives, often women, who care. And that burden is often too high, especially for feminists, and it subjects them to lots of violence, essentially, in their everyday work. Feminist political scientists have been thinking about this for a long time, and they raise the important question about shifting the burden of feminist representation from women, and individuals always, onto systems and processes. And they've been pushing the agenda for what they refer to as feminist democratic representation through democratic innovation. So a lot of this is quite blue skies, it's untested, but what they argue for is, first of all, looking at formal inclusion, so gender quotas for sure, and other forms of positive action to pull in minoritized women. And then creating structures within parliaments for the formal inclusion and listening to marginalised women's voices, rather than just relying on informal or tokenistic efforts in this regard. They also include in these kinds of blueprints protections for the resistance that we know will come if we make these changes. So these, as I said, are untested, but they raise questions about how we could redesign formal political institutions to include feminist and intersectional principles, looking outside of formal politics and taking into account that there is no perfect model of feminist leadership. We have examples of women leaders working differently inside and outside of formal institutions. Kelly Dittmar and other African-American scholars in the US, Adrienne Wright and her colleagues, they looked at all the things that happened during COVID. And they did really careful processing, tracing of policy decisions. And they identified that Black, particularly, and Latina mayors during COVID demonstrated the most intersectional forms of leadership and had the best outcomes for their cities. Nadia Brown has also looked for a long time at the way in which Black women have worked on the regional level and across the aisle between political parties in contexts like a maternal health caucus group that put the issue of African-American women's very poor outcomes in maternal health care on the agenda for the very first time because of the way in which they worked consistently and collaborated to place that issue. Alba Lanza's comparative work has looked at how the women's movement in Scotland and Catalonia dealt with territorial debates using feminist principles. The Scottish referendum, I know many people here probably are very aware of the Scottish women's movement and may have connections with them. But in the referendum on leaving the UK, it really indicated the potential of territorial debates themselves to energise the women's movement, something that we didn't really have a lot of evidence for before. We found that those debates would pull people apart from each other. At her work, she looked at how feminist leaders work to use the devolution process, using arguments about democratisation to demand feminist inclusion in devolution processes. And women on either side of Remain and Leave, once that referendum was settled, got back together very quickly to push ahead on trying to create a feminist discourse around devolution. In Catalonia, it worked differently. Feminist groups didn't want to touch the territorial issue of succession for that region in Spain, but they found ways to work together, even if they disagreed on the issue of succession, particularly around reproductive rights. A key insight from a lot of these kinds of projects is the benefit from feminist legislators maintaining their messages in the public sphere and in the corridors of power, even if there is no obvious benefit in the short term. They also found power in the tactical use of inquiries of litigation and publicising evidence of attacks as a way to keep gender equality on the agenda. Now, the space to do this is very different in Hungary. This is about using feminist art and theatre and cultural production because it's not safe enough to do anything else really. And women's groups have been largely defunded or closed down. But the common thread is that feminist leadership maintains its core commitments, but it can flex and extend alliances beyond gender equality advocates to include pro-democracy and other civil society actors. And it can incorporate analysis of the broader economic and social factors that contribute to inequalities. So feminist leadership, according to these scholars and activists, is not then only about political power, but it's also about ideas. It's about knowledge. And it is about embodied knowledge produced through activist work. So it's about moving politics back to the ground. Something that we've done very well here, actually, in the women's movement in the context of storytelling about people's experiences. We have evidence of where this works. Slovenia is a good example where feminist and LGBT plus movements were very successful in contributing to legislative reforms, and they thwarted efforts to pass very regressive legislation. Going back to Spain briefly, the government of Catalonia has pushed back against the right-wing Vox party, who wasn't even in power, but managed to close down lots of funding and also agency supporting sexual reproductive rights and violence against women support. The establishment of the Ministry of Equality and Feminism in that region was remarkable, and the feminist leadership shown by its minister, Tanya Verge, has been quoted around the globe as an example of an extraordinary effort to pull other ministries into account and to use very deeply rooted feminist principles to improve the situation, particularly in the context of having very little positional power outside of her ministry. She has endorsed the idea of de-emphasising at times feminist labelling of policy outcomes. Not everybody will agree on that, but that is one of the strategies she's used to build broader societal support and to advance the value of policy to deliver broad public goods. I mean, that's something we've been saying about feminist ideas forever, and that is this is about the collective good, the public good. What can go wrong? Feminists in France have made a mess of it to an extent. You know, there has been a large debate around street harassment in France that has been deeply racialised, and French feminists have been very late to the game to really take an intersectional approach. They were very reactive about it, and they completely failed to hold on to that space as a gender issue, and it has been appropriated by the far right in France. Raluska looks at Poland and the newer member states of the EU, and there's lots written about how the EU's very bureaucratic way of placing gender equality on top of societies, particularly through gender mainstreaming, has really fueled a lot of the anti-gender equality movements now. A lack of sensitivity to the cultural differences there and not working on the ground with grassroots feminist organisations is now having implications many years later. Leah Beazle and Akugo Mijulu looked in a massive project across Europe, looking just particularly at women of colour and their activism against austerity and to support asylum seekers. And they found women who had struggled for years to get access to white feminist spaces to do intersectional work and found it impossible to be taken seriously and to be considered to be equal and have their voices heard. So a key takeaway from all of this is, of course, that feminist leadership must take into account how minoritised women themselves evolve distinctive forms of political imagination and collective and careful leadership styles that challenge dominant political culture. So when we think about a feminist leadership for the future, we need it to be evaluated in terms of its effectiveness, but also its inclusiveness. And it has to pose challenge consistently to democratic institutions. We need to recognise the value of political ideas that arise from the margins, and this may include what some people have called a re-enchantment of our leadership and politics. That includes a lot of things that we used to talk about in feminism, being tender and gentle with each other. The holding of grief, pain, disappointment and trauma alongside joy, creativity, and rather than fault finding, this is about feminist world building. And this is difficult. Visions of a feminist future can be hazy and daunting. But the reality is that the process of journeying together, we know, is not about sisterhood. It's something much more complex and real. It's about acknowledging our differences and the links, as Orla mentioned earlier, to common issues and the links between issues such as gender equality, climate justice and anti-racism. We have examples of what a shared feminist future might look like. I know from talking to Orla and others that Women's Aid, North and South, have been working together very effectively. There are emergent conversations between communities responding to anti-migrant violence. Pearson has looked at women groups in the North, particularly around the issue of abortion, and looked at the ways in which they have worked really constructively. But it all needs to be resourced. Can't all just work on good intentions. And I know the Women's Council has called for a women's fund. There are probably other initiatives or suggestions out of there. But institutional redesign should still be on the table. And that will require things like gender quotas and maybe things like reserved seats or nested quotas for particular groups of women and other minorities. Fundamentally, and I finish on this, the power of feminist thinking, and I think we all know this from our own lived experience, is its inclusivity. It's a way of being with others, a spirit of interconnection and care, shaping the future that we want and have not yet experienced in our lives as women. It's also about entering into an actual imagination battle, because it's offering an antidote to all of the apocalyptic thinking that we have and the failures and the inabilities to imagine a better future. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. That was really brilliant. There's so much in that. And thanks also, I think, for giving us a sense as well as to what's happening across Europe for women's movements. Yeah, I think there's so much food for thought in that we'll be discussing. So I'm now going to ask the panel members to come up. So just to first introduce you to Salome Mbugua, who is the CEO of Akidwa. Akidwa is the migrant women's organisation based in the South. Salome is a researcher, gender equality activist, human rights advocate for the past 20 years and has enormous experience in working with underrepresented groups, particularly women, children, young people in Europe, Africa and internationally. So we're delighted to have Salome, to have you here as chair of the panel. Please come up. And then our panel members, we're really delighted to have Senator Lynn Ruane here. I know many of you will know her in the room. Lynn is an independent Irish senator based in the South. She served as senator and deputy leader of the Civil Engagement Group in Shannon since 2016. Lynn is a community activist, a drugs worker, has worked in Tala, which is a historically underserved and neglected community in Dublin. And I think people will know the many issues that you've championed, Lynn, I think on behalf of working class women in the South. I also want to introduce you to Aoife Clements, who's the founder of 50/50 Northern Ireland. Aoife is passionate about gender equality, including women in legislative procedure. She's currently undertaking a PhD at Queen's University School of Law and is also a member of the Forum. And also with us is Geraldine McAteer. There you are. Geraldine, can you come up? Geraldine is a former Sinn Féin councillor for Belfast City Council Balmoral constituency and also former CEO of the West Belfast Partnership, a lifelong community activist. Geraldine's founder member of FEILA. And I think many of you will have been at FEILA this year. It was absolutely brilliant. And also Geraldine's been a key contributor to post-conflict discussions and community representation. So you're really welcome, Geraldine, and thanks for joining us. And then we have Joanne Sansome, who's a disability activist, campaigner and researcher from Belfast, both has been campaigning in the North, but also broader in terms of the UK, and has worked with government and non-governmental organisations and also within organisations of disabled people to create awareness in terms of disability rights and inclusion. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Salome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ola, and good morning, everyone. It's really very good to be in Belfast at the Queen University and to meet actually the forum. You know, after such a long time, I've not been coming to these forum meetings, but I know we also had some challenges that we had a break there. But just to say, I don't know where to start because both Aura and Pauline have given us a very good foundation of what you're going to discuss in this panel. And also to acknowledge that, you know, all of us understand the barriers that are there for women engaging in political participation. So we can only repeat them, but we know them. And I hope maybe by the end of this meeting, we'll advance a little bit on really how can we position ourselves and claim for the positions that we need to change and transform the island that we all want to live in. Pauline spoke about, also the challenges which are there, and also so many other things. But, funding for women is important. It's really, really important if women are going to advance, the opportunities and positioning themselves into this area of leadership and political participation. We didn't have actually funding for the All Ireland Women Forum for a while, because we can only be able to meet and do things when we are well resourced. So this group needs to be very well resourced. And I just actually want to say that, it's very challenging because the world look at Ireland as very progressive when we come to gender equality. They look at us as a good example, an example to the world. And this is what happened in July. The Gate Foundation were in Ireland. And why? Because they wanted to meet, some women leaders in Ireland and share with them how has Ireland been able to progress so well in, progressing gender equality. And so when they asked the six of us who had met, how has Ireland managed to do this? We all looked at each other because we have not progressed, and they were actually very excited for us to give us the hint and, all that, has been done by women. But to be quite sincere, I like also acknowledging the efforts that women has made. And in particular, the women from both South and North of Ireland, your courage and the voice of the women, in these situations sometimes where they are very, very difficult. For example, the Northern Ireland Women Coalition, I started this coalition when I was actually doing my studies in Trinity, and I admired them. I longed to meet them, and let me tell you, I met them. Their courage, and their persistence, because that's what we need to do, to be persistent and to be courageous, to be able to overcome the challenges that we have. And so we have also to acknowledge that, women continue to fight hard, and we should not despair or give up, on fighting and claiming for our spaces and our positions as well. And also, in the North, when I looked at it, why people are looking at us as very progressive is the leadership of women. I have been in Ireland for 30 years, but in those 30 years, we have spent some years trying to rechange the constitution of Ireland, based on the referendums that have been done. For example, on marriage equality, access to abortion and all these kind of things. And who are the leaders of this? I actually can't put men and to put them to claim that they led these, successes. It's women who have led these successes. And I think we can do better still in getting into positions of leadership and decision-making and positioning ourselves to be able to structure the society that we want to live in, to reshape the society. So this panel, where we are going to imagine the leadership that we want, that when we walk to the door in Dublin or even here, that we see that reflections of women from diverse background, and also not only sitting there and being addressed, but being the one who are addressing as well. So for us, reimagining is not actually replacing one class of group who are the women or from, women from a different class. It's about actually trying to replace control with care, and embracing diversity, and, appreciating where people are coming from. So it's retaining people dignity and all that. It's also sometimes, I ran for Senate, and I know how it's difficult. Our senator will be able to tell us that as well. It's very, very difficult because, you meet all types of people, this competition. So instead of competition, how can we collaborate and work together, both men, women, and us women positioning ourselves and actually being listened and being taken seriously for whatever we say. So it's very important, that we continue to talk about these issues, but to move beyond just addressing the challenges that are there for women, as barriers, and to position ourselves on how can we step up and move up into building, better societies and positioning ourselves to build better societies. So how can we get that shared leadership? The panel has already been introduced to you, and I'm actually just going to to have that conversation with them to help us on how can we reimagine a better leadership in this island of Ireland, both south and north, building that inclusive political civic spaces, and Pauline have actually teased them all very well. I hope you still remember them. So we will move forward and maybe hear from the panel on what they think of this imagining of a better leadership, in the north and south, which should be inclusive, and, respecting everybody from where they're coming from. But before we do that, I think we should start maybe by people introducing themselves on maybe what does feminist leadership means to each and every one of the panelists, because I think it will be easier for us to be able to know, to understand better where they're coming from, yeah? So what does feminist leadership means to you? I'll start with you, Joanne, from the very end.
For me, it means being inclusive of my. For me, it means being inclusive of every intersectionality, but framing it in a way where women have a strong voice, because we are 51% of the population in the north, and it's not reflected within the institutions. It's reflected in civic societal groups, more so, but that's because they have a lesser voice, and it's very controlled by the structures that are male dominated through funding. So I think we need to look at it intersectionality and inclusively.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And that's really very, very important. I think, Pauline, you actually highlighted that on that aspect of intersectionality. And Ora did mention that at the beginning, because really, we need the diversity of women in leadership and decision making, that all voices are heard and that everybody is included in actually deciding on or designing the society that we want. Geraldine, what would you say is your feminist leadership, what feminist leadership means to you?
Well, to me, feminist leadership is all about confronting the causes of inequality and working towards bringing about equality for women. And I agree as well, all the intersectional groups as well. So, and doing that in a manner which is very inclusive. So in other words, really involving women in that, in all their various sections, right across the whole range, as much as you can, through communities, within politics, within political parties, across political parties. And also, I think the kind of underpinning values in there as well, apart from being inclusive, is to try and be as collegiate as you can. Try and work towards collaboration, agreement on what it is that you need to achieve to get equality for women, and try to be collaborative across political parties, across the community sector, across the whole range of groups, those with disabilities, migrants who have come in, the whole range that we have who are very marginalised, LGBTQ+. So, I think that to me is about bringing about equality, people achieving their rightful place in society. I think all of that makes for a far better society, a much more equal place, a healthier place, a safe place to be. And as I say, those values of inclusiveness, being collegiate, being collaborative, confronting inequality where you see it, and, getting the data together. The kind of information in that we've heard earlier, getting other ideas around that, I think all very important.
Thank you so much. And you bring that, confronting process of inequality there and data, which is very important, even to be able to inform on where we are. And it was actually very good to hear from Pauline, even giving examples from other places. Coming to you, Senator Lynn, what's your...
I have a very, very difficult relationship with feminism, if I'm going to be honest. And I'm always apprehensive to talk about it because it feels like it's ever evolving. I'm constantly thinking, exploring and figuring it out what it means for me in my life and where I'm situated in my life and, you know, and the environment in which I live in. So for me, it's like sometimes it's trying to figure out what it's not. And then you know, even when we speak about intersectionality, I think, unfortunately, I do think that there's a lack of substance of understanding from an experiential perspective of what it actually means to come from an extremely under-resourced, resourced and underserved community. I think people potentially theoretically kind of go, yes, intersectionality, that's important. But the lived understanding of that and how it lives and sits in your body is very, very absent then from the actions that we take as feminists when we go out and do the actual work. How can I give an example of that? Say, you know, if we look at, so a lot of my work focuses on working with men.
Yeah.
And it's feminist work I'm doing, but I'm working with men. But people want you to be potentially, you know, calling this out and calling that out, in a performance way online, and that's somehow feminism, rather than in doing work on the ground with a small percentage of people who are, say, doing the most harm, who happen to be men. They've experienced violence as victims and now they're perpetrating violence. And I'm like, well, I'm going to choose to bring my feminist thinking and thinking about emancipation and liberation and the meeting of one's needs into that space. But it's for the broader safety and advancement of women and everyone in those intersectional communities. And that's just one example. Another example is I find it harder and harder to be able to support, say, particular narratives online from whether they be feminists, male or female feminists, who would say if you have a working class person or somebody that has potentially never worked generationally, because working class is a very noble thing to get behind, but in our communities, there's a lot of communities that and families that haven't worked for a long time, and they're kind of not included in that intersectionality piece or that advocacy piece from a feminist or a left perspective. And you know, you will see in that, say, if somebody from that community, whether it be anti-immigrant sentiment, whether it be homophobia, whether they say something online that's really problematic, the problematic thing isn't called out, but you have so-called feminist or leftist allies putting nothing but class tropes underneath the posts about someone's problematic view that happens to be from a particular class. So you've people then that go, oh, that's me, or I have dyslexia, or I left school very young, but the attack that this person is getting is, oh, I didn't know you could spell. Oh, I didn't know you knew a big word like that. Instead of actually going, the thing you're talking about is really problematic and here is why. And treating that person, even though you disagree with them, with a level of respect and equality in relation to, I'm going to call out what you're saying here and hold you accountable, but I'm not going to throw a load of classist remarks at you and everyone else is cheering from the sidelines, because the rest of our women in our communities and men from a class perspective are looking on going, oh, they're inadvertently also insulting me, even though I don't agree with what that person is saying. So I think I have quite a difficult relationship with understanding what actually is feminist leadership and how is it actually truly intersectional, so that it's reaching the furthest in its solidarity and efforts of liberation, in a sense, rather than it being kind of girl boss. We're all going to make posts and call this out and call that out, but nobody's in the heart of communities doing what we need to be doing. And there's lots of women doing that who you'll never hear of or you'll never know, you know.
That's actually very true. You bring very important and valid points here. Sometimes I think we do miss that understanding of intersectionality, because sometimes we do use terminologies and language that not everyone understands, and we actually sometimes adopt this language and use it, throughout. And we are learning from you as well. Feminist movement, so does it is. It's a struggle actually to convince everybody on what, every other person think of what feminist is. So, and that's why it's important for everybody to define themselves and where they stand, when we talk about feminist, and then connecting it to the whole issue of leadership. I go to Aoife, if you can be able to tell us what it is.
So I think for me, feminist leadership is a form of leadership that when you think about the policy that you're making, the project that you're making, the service you're providing, that the person that's using that is not this default white, able-bodied, heterosexual man, that when you're designing something and you think, who is the person that's going to be least able to access the service, or who's the person that's going to be least able to get on this bus or live in this city, that is the person that should be at the center of your policy making or your project planning. And I think the best way to do that is, like what you were saying, is to have diversity in politics, because you can learn and you can read, and you can learn about experiences, sure, but there's nothing quite like having the authentic lived experience of being a working class person, a migrant, trans woman, anything like that. So they should be at the center of the work that we're doing. I think it's really important, because I think neoliberalism has done what it does best, where it absorbs some kind of social justice project feminism and kind of spits it back out as nothingness, right? And I think actually feminist leadership is not being confined by, bourgeois respectability and saying that something is just not feminist, okay? Every choice a woman makes is not feminist just because she's a woman, right? So I think, we need to be more, do kind of gatekeep it, right? Make sure that it stays what it is, and call people out, and don't subscribe to these respectability ideas, because that is patriarchy. So I think it's really important to keep people in the middle and be really confident about it and know that what you're doing is right. And also for me, one of the biggest things about feminist leadership, I think, is creativity and imagination. It's so important. And I think about Rachel Reeves as a woman in politics, but her decisions so far have been the least creative, most unimaginative things. The easiest decision you can do is take money away from disabled people. That is embarrassing, right? That's embarrassing. So yeah, it needs imagination and creativity, and just the ability to think outside the box. Fundamentally epistemic change, but yeah, thinking differently.
Yeah, that's actually very important, because we are not just saying that, we are removing one group to replace ourselves to do, the very best we can. But also I want to say that, feminist leadership is very personal and political, based on actually what you have described, in this panel. And it's good to ensure that, it reflects, the diversity of women. When we talk about the diversity of women, sometimes we feel that we leave some women out. So even when we talk about intersectionality, and Senator Lynn, you just mentioned there on people who are normally left, it's true, some people are left, and we have to be able to acknowledge and check who is not, on the table, or who has been left behind. And just to move on, because even when I started, I said that, we've done great things north and south. There's quite a lot that has been happening, positive things that women have done, both, north and south. What would you say are the values that unite women, that unite us, as women from the north and south? I'll start with you again, Joanne.
Okay. Well, I think it's important to look at what we have in common always, because I think if you start from a place of what you have in common, it's easier to kind of build on and then look at what we don't have in common throughout that, and work the lesson, the differences through commonalities. Sorry, can everybody hear me okay? Sorry, I was looking at the chair instead of the audience, sorry. So I think working in commonality is really important, and building relationships of trust, and I think that can only be done through co-production. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm a big believer in deliberative civic democracy, and I really think that needs to be embedded within all the institutions, local, national, and international, more than what it is. And the Belfast Good Friday Agreement allows for that in a way through the civic forum idea, although it's outdated now and very prescriptive. So that would need to be updated and changed. But again, that's something that we could all come together on through our commonalities and our lived experiences. And it wouldn't just be a feminist issue either. It would be across society. It's society wide. What I like about deliberative democracy is it focuses on the census and data of the population. So what I was saying earlier about 51% of our population being female, that would mean that for anything with deliberative democracy, that 51 people would have to be female, but that would encompass all the intersectionalities that's included within the female gender. So it could work, but politicians, they fear it. Because my feeling on it is that they fear it because they think it will take away their power. But actually, the citizens' assemblies down south have worked really well. But although they've worked well, they've only been on contentious issues, so they're not within the daily bread and butter of politics, even down south, even though it's globally renowned for being one of the best countries to do deliberative democracy. It's still not embedded within the actual everyday working of down south. So I think that is a real it's an opportunity. I was going to say a missed opportunity, but it's not a missed opportunity. It's an opportunity to grow and develop as a shared island. We could do something around deliberative democracy as a shared island, as a collaborative, and everyone's voice would be included, but the female voice would be statistically included, which I think is where the space we need to get to.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joanne, and bringing that democracy perspective as well and explaining
Because
it very well.
the reason why I like it also as a disabled person is because the whole election process is very it has a lot of barriers for disabled people because of societal attitudes and barriers towards disability, where the deliberative democracy process is based on almost like a jury system. If you're registered, there's a chance you could be called to be part of a deliberative democracy panel or assembly.
Thank you. And actually that also brings the intersectionality piece. You're a woman and then you have all these other,
yes.
Yeah. So Geraldine, would you like to give your perspective on the same question? What unites us? And
just to recap, that was on shared values, was it? North and South, yeah. Well, I guess I'll speak to my experience really in terms of where I think, there's a lot of similarities and so on. And my background would be basically, I've lived and worked in the west of the city, in West Belfast, all my life, basically. And apart from going to college in Dublin for a couple of years, that was an experience, but nothing like West Belfast at all. But I think the kind of values and the experiences that I would share would be that, certainly looking back at West Belfast, I mean, at the moment, it's quite a thriving district. It's still down on paper as being, you know, one of the areas with high unemployment. It still suffers from a degree of poverty, especially during the cost of living crisis at the minute and so on. But it is very vibrant. And if you're going into West Belfast, any of the really new developments that have completely transformed the district have really been developed by the community sector. And the people who led that sector are women. And I mean, I would say that, you know, certainly when I was growing up in the west of the city, it was a very, very challenging place to live. You know, we were like the epicenter of the conflict almost, it seemed, for a long time. So we were living in a very violent atmosphere. We were ringed by British Army forts. You would have had, you know, patrols out there, their vehicles all the time, blanket searches, house searches, and the actual level of people going to prison was completely unbelievable. Including a couple out of my own house. My sister at 17 was interned. So that was all very common in that area, and people were very, very challenged. And but, you know, I'm interested in what Aoife had to say around creativity and so on. You know, when your back is at the wall and you have nothing, you know, we found that really women were the most creative people, and women were the people who got on with it and had to rear families, had to feed them, had to go to work, had to deal with all the day-to-day business of getting kids to school and all of that. And they were the people really who, not just in my area, but I see Eileen here from the Shankill, and your experience would have been, you know, probably quite similar, maybe not the amount of British Army patrols we'd have had in the Shankill, you know, but on the falls. But, you know, people, you know, really struggling to get on with life and deal with social and economic injustice and all of that. So, you know, really women were to the fore in that. And, you know, everything from, you know, as I say, trying to, you know, mobilise around issues such as creating childcare facilities, developing, and I'm looking at Aoife Ruane here, you know, developing up new ways of getting education into the, you know, there were a lot of women returners, people who had not been able to access education the first time around. The day-to-day living was so volatile in terms of education that not, you know, even children weren't able to get to school a lot of the time. So, you know, a lot of that around educational programs, around childcare. We had our first women's centre. I remember getting in and cleaning the building when we first got it, I think in 1982. And that was to deal with issues to do with domestic violence, I have to say, and also really to challenge inequality and really empower women in any way that could be done, you know, to take their rightful place. We also, as well as that, as time went on, you know, after the ceasefires, Good Friday Agreement, there was a lot of peace and reconciliation money come in, also European Union money when we were still Objective 1. And we would have developed up training, employment programs to actually try and assist people, young people especially, to get onto a good education, good training, able to access a job, and not just a job, but careers. Because that's the other thing that you would find out when it came to working class people that talked about your jobs, it was never about careers. And so, you know, a lot of that work had to be done. We were really regarded as a completely terrorist community. I mean, we were called that in the Houses of Parliament. There were documentaries made about how bad we were. You know, we were criminals, we were gangsters. We didn't work, not because of discrimination in jobs, but because we were basically lazy people, bone lazy. Hadn't an hour's work in us. That's, you know, this is what was portrayed about us. And, you know, to the extent that actually, I think it was the Conservatives, Douglas Hurd, had it made by law that if you had a Republican on your community group, you would lose your funding. The little bit of funding you had, you would lose. It was called the Hurd agreement, you know. So if you had a Republican anywhere, you know, about the place, that was it. You lost your funding. And women did lose their funding. The Falls Women's Centre lost their funding. The Conway Education Centre lost their funding. And that's what they did. And, you know, so we had to look at how do we reinvent ourselves? How do we re-image ourselves? And one of the awful things was that we used to lose during the 9th of August, the anniversary of internment every year. There was always riots and we always lost. There was always children ended up being shot and killed, and there was a lot of burning of buses and so on. So we actually, you know, came together in the community with our elected reps and looked at what else can we do here? How do we really displace these events, you know, around 9th of August? And we come up with the idea of a festival, you know, and it was our opportunity really to present to ourselves, but to celebrate ourselves to each other. But also to present to the world a completely different face, you know, the one that was a vibrant community, that did know how to help itself, that did develop, that was empowered, and all of those things. And I mean, we had lots of people who come in and helped us, you know, you'd the likes of Stephen Ray, and that would have brought in plays. You had all sorts of choirs that would have came in. You had street parties. You know, a whole mix of international acts and local acts. Now, how does that share values with down south? I mean, many's the time when we were putting together programs in the north. I remember one program I had responsibility for, and it was like, you know, a big European program. We had collaborated with the good people of the Shankill Road. So we're a big Catholic district, big Protestant district just across the peace line. And actually, this was before the Good Friday Agreement. We were collaborating with each other, you know, for years beforehand. And we put in a joint bid to Europe. And we got monies, you know, for the regeneration of the two neighbourhoods. So on the Shankill would have been for early years. And for us, it was mainly for young people, getting young people into training, into employment, etc. But I have to say, they don't want to say who, but I mean, the consultants who came in, basically it looked like a program of, you know, go-karting for joyriders. You know, we had a big joyriding problem. So, you know, I was looking at others. We were looking at it collectively and saying, this is just money for creating pastimes for young people that aren't really going to develop them. So we were looking at what could we do that would bring about, you know, actual true skills development. And we went down south. And this is where, you know, sharing contacts and networks is very important. We went down to North Dublin and we looked at what they were doing there. They had job assist centres. They had training programs that were geared towards young people. They had business people involved and so on. So, like, to be honest, we literally drove down in a day, had a good look, went back, you know, rewrote a lot of plans, and, you know, I, in many respects, built up relationships with quite a few of people and organisations in Dublin who also had European funding for regeneration in their areas. And I mean, I have to say a lot of those values that we had were very much about being people-centred. So focusing on the young people themselves in our neighbourhoods, focusing on women, focusing on what would actually regenerate the area. So, you know, as Tony Blair used to say, very much about education, early years. getting people skilled up in growth, what we thought would be growth sector industries and so on. And but also, I guess the values that we shared really was then the generosity of sharing, you know, of people being able to share what programs they had. If people had applications, they would exchange those with you. Be very open about their data, be very open about how they got things through. And also, as I say, getting very much about what will make a difference to people, you know. So, I mean, you know, as I say, a lot of the stuff that was put to us and you know, by consultants, they just were out of touch with our communities.
Yeah.
They really didn't understand working class communities. They didn't understand what people were up against. And so we, you know, we developed a raft of programs like that. So the kind of, I guess, value base there was really about true regeneration is people-centered.
Yes.
Also about sharing information, working collegiately together and following up with each other, you know, a lot of lifelong contacts established there. And I suppose also how to work in with your, you know, your political elected representatives as well, to make sure you were getting the right kind of support behind you.
And we may actually come back to that, but I didn't want to cut you because, like, you know, we are getting a very good information from you, and it's very hard to listen even on how women were penalized, you know, like the losing of fund and all that. But going back to the creativity and imagination, because if you did bring this up, what else would you say unite women North and South in terms of values?
I think actually echoes what you've been saying is, for me, I think the thing that I really think unites women across the island and the rest of Britain as well is this community focused aspect to their work and kind of selecting issues to champion based on like the lived experience. Like that's where it's very bottom up, like truly. And then doing what it takes to help that. So like, you know, really, really iconic things like, you know, the contraceptive train, or it was women that broke the Falls Road curfew, right? Because women couldn't get out to do the shopping and stuff. So that was broken by women. So like, yeah, I think the values that we share is that we are in the community, we see what's going on, we see what people are suffering, and like we decide to do something about it, you know, and I think that that's really important. And then doing something in really creative ways. And then also, I guess, like in elected politics, which is what I speak to women in elected politics about, I think what unites a lot, not all, unfortunately, a lot of women in elected politics is that they are actually like value driven by something, some kind of issue that they care about, and that is what's taken them into politics. Whereas with some women and like a lot of men, they're more driven by like prestige or, you know, that things that aren't really important. So yeah, I think the shared value is that like community focused work.
Very good. And actually that takes us back to Senator Lynn, you know, because you seem to be very community rooted, you know, and you did express that, you know, when you were describing your perspective on feminist leadership. And I just actually want to ask, you know, and you can also answer the question that I had asked about the values earlier, that community leadership, can it really help to create a more inclusive society? If it can, how can it be, you know, modeled or, you know, structured?
Well, I think there's so many ways in which you can answer that, and I think, you know, it's such a collection of things. I'm only going to be able to, like, you know, maybe highlight one or two things that I think, but you know, I think we look at community development, and community development has been completely hijacked and privatized. It has become this idea of job activation rather than actually building agency, autonomy in communities where they can have decision making, where decision making is localized. Decisions have been pulled back closer and closer into centralized governments, pushing, you know, people out into the HSE for services instead of bringing everything back into the community. So the problem is not always necessarily the people themselves in the communities doing the work. It's actually the lack of challenging of power, really, and where power is concentrated. And even earlier on, when you spoke about other nations thinking that Ireland was doing so well, you have to, in terms of a gender perspective, you have to ask what women are telling that story. And the fact is that first of all, working class people have never got to tell their own story. But now working class women are going to have their story told internationally by privileged women who entered that space still with more power than every other community of women that we were talking about. You know, so it's like, who gets to tell the story and how? And we have to dismantle power at a centralized level. Like, you have women who say they're feminists, but vote in parties who uphold the patriarchy. So I think there's a real lack of coherency and congruency, and that ultimately people will protect their own power and their own interests, regardless if they show some sort of sympathy or empathy towards other women or other communities that may not have access. So I think the problem is we need to challenge those with power, and we need to completely restructure what society looks like as a whole. Like, often we put women in poor communities into rooms and ask them to work with us and brainstorm with us about how they're going to improve their situation or get out of their poverty. But we're not putting those with the most power in the room going, sorry, what are you going to do about your privilege? You know, what are you going to do about all that power that you have there? Do you know what I mean? We're asking people with no resources to change and restructure society when they didn't structure it in the first place.
Yes.
So sometimes I think we look in the wrong direction. And that's not to say that people aren't powerful and have lots of creativity and lots of imagination. They have the answers, but they just don't have the resources to actually bring life to those. People that are closest to the issues are always closest to the solutions, but people consult them, and then that's all it is. It's a consultation. It's not an actual, okay, you have the solutions, but now we're going to tell you how you're actually going to do it. And then it's still capitalistic, it's still neoliberal, it's still from a privileged perspective, whether they're feminists or not. So the problem is the distribution of power, the distribution of decision making, and the fact that what we share, I think, across the island is a lack of agency and autonomy within our communities, and also the history of colonization and its intersectional with institutionalization, and the level of grief that's potentially still unresolved in our family lineages. It's all there. There's so much there. That's what I'm saying. It's such a hard question to answer, because you could bring it in a million directions. And I think the million of the directions you bring it in, it will all come back to the concentration of power anyway.
And for sure, like they are even mentioning about for the situation of North, the whole issue of peace and reconciliation, you know, sometimes taken for granted, and there's no structures put into place to be able to address what is exactly going on, you know, to be able to reconcile people and bring real peace, you know, for people in general. You spoke about, you know, distribution of power, and it would be good if the men, we only have two men, okay, can agree to share the power, you know, in the audience. I said, it's very, very difficult. You know, you see it even, you know, when you go to speak, they want even to change the debate and the way you are talking. So that distribution of power is quite challenging. It's not there. There's no shared power. I hope there's a day where we will see that shared power and women being afforded the opportunity, not even the opportunity. It should happen automatically. We are 51%, you know, of the population. So we should see 51% in the parliament, but our parliament, it doesn't happen like that. But to move the discussions a little bit forward, and actually we are almost running out of time, I really wanted to hear from each and every one of you what structures should change. You know, what structures do we need to change to ensure that more women take up, you know, these leadership positions? You know, we are talking about, Senator Lynn spoke about systemic, you know, all these systemic challenges that we have there, the hierarchies that we have, the power, you know, relations and all that. So what structures changes do we need, you know, as a society, both North and South, to be able to ensure that more women take more leadership positions? I'll start with you, Joanne, as well.
Well, again, I think we need deliberative, co-produced democracy, from local the right way through, because it cuts away the need for, well, it cuts away the voting element of it, and I know that people will probably go, that's not democratic, But if you're representing the population as a representative whole, then that's more, that in a way that's more democratic than what the assembly is at the moment, because it's not representative of the people, and they call themselves a representative democracy, but they're so not. And just as the panel was saying earlier, we need to know who's telling our story and through what lens, and how they come to get that story. Is it through consultants? Is it through community groups, charities, or is it through actual people? So that's what deliberative co-produced democracy, that is the gap. It could close, because just as you were saying, we are all invited to rooms and tables and discussions, and we're all asked to consult, but nearly always, 99% of the time, they already have a preset agenda, and you don't hear back afterwards to see what they've actually produced from the discussions. And then maybe a few years down the line, some politician brings forward a motion and tries to attribute it to those discussions, and you're like, I was in the room. That's nothing like what was discussed. That's based on your take and today's societal trend. So I think we need to close all of that and be more transparent and more people focused, like you said.
That's very good. More people focused as well. We are going to move a little bit faster because our time is not on our side. So please be very precise. And it's still about on those structural that we need to change. We also heard about the cyber abuse, which has now become the 6C.
Yeah.
So a lot of women are also scared. And Dr. Pauline have actually done a lot of research on this area from diverse, group of women on how they experience that kind of abuse, online abuse, and how that put women off as well, and also risking their life sometimes. So we're just going to be very brief on what you think on structure before we give the audience a chance to.
Yeah, that's very tough. It's a tough one, It's a tough one because, I mean, I think in terms of public life, I think you have a great deal of representation of women within the community and the voluntary sector and the sectional areas that we've discussed as well. But really what we need to see, and for example, I mean, I was a local councillor, and when I went in as a councillor, I was brought in due to a casual vacancy or whatever, and so what I'm going to say is I think that really political parties should look broadly at where they draw women from. Because certainly if we're talking about councils, they tend to they want somebody who's from the area. They want somebody from the area, somebody that knows the area. Now, look, I'm from West Belfast, and they asked me to stand in South, which is one of the most, it's as I said, it's a fabulous constituency, but it's a very wealthy constituency, apart from the number of loyalist neighbourhoods that are in it. And there's many issues there. But I think that generally speaking, that if you're just going with someone local who really knows the area, then it's going to be very difficult for anyone who wants to go in as a councillor and who's not from a local area, to break through. So I think maybe political parties need to look at, is there any other, how can we try and bring more women in but women who are not necessarily from the immediate local, you know, how do you engage other women at a local level in city council? Now, I think mentoring is very important.
Yes.
So structurally, you know, what I've tried to do with other women that I know who are interested in getting into council politics is say, well, for a start, why don't you come along to some of the committee meetings? You know, if they, for example, would be in a community group or a voluntary group or any of that. I don't like to be a buffer between, you know, council and what they're doing, but say come into committee meetings, make a presentation. You get the opportunities to speak, to debate with the committee and so on. But everything is very closely time managed. You know? So I would also try and suggest to people there are other arm's length bodies, city council, that would be like, for example, the Policing and Community Safety Partnerships.
Yes.
This is also a key vehicle for looking at violence against women and young girls and so on. So there are bodies like that where you would encourage people to apply. Now, when they were set up, they were actually set up to reflect, community. They were set up with a range of ages, persons with disability, and so on. You know, that you would really get a much better take on what, what communities looked at, because there's a Belfast Central one, then a South East, West and North one. So,
actually to hold there because I'm actually
sorry.
for time,
Yeah.
but we'll come back to you. Hold even to Lane and Aoife as well. I want to ask also the audience, because you may be able to answer also what they may have. People in the room, if anybody have a question, and you can answer when we come back to finish anything that you want to finish on, just to be able to save time. Yeah.
Geraldine, I think so as well. It's amazing. But I think everyone's also touched on it. Geraldine, you said like consultants don't understand our communities. I think there was just a report on like how much Stormont or something is spent on consultants, and it's like a crazy amount. And like, so I suppose like, how do we like fight against that? Because like, think even in like the women's sector, there was an issue of like co-designing a gender equality strategy, but then like consultants were brought in to write it, and they like screwed it up entirely. And it's like, it seems like, lived experience, feel like it's like a buzzword that's like thrown around and used, but then like they don't actually incorporate lived experience or like engage with the community voluntary sector. And then there's a whole other issue of like community voluntary sector organizations within the community aren't held as in high regard as like academics or like think tanks and all that sort of stuff. So even when you're put in a room, it's almost like what you've got to say and the experience that you're bringing is like at a lower tier, or like considered lower than experience that's in a report or that's in a published magazine or something like that. So it's just be interested to hear from yourselves like what you think. How do we like kind of fight against that, and how do we break that issue of like community level knowledge is thought of as lesser than, because it's like everyone's talked about how much great information, wealth of information, and there is at a community level that's being done, but it just feels like there's a gap of reaching that to actual like government.
That's fine. Actually, we take a few questions and come back, because I also think Elaine spoke more on community as well. So Geraldine, maybe, and you can highlight that. Mary at the back, yeah?
Yeah. My question would be, do you think a women's commissioner would help? We have commissioners for, and the recent two was for the Irish language, which represents a very small population, and for the Ulster Scots, which represents even a smaller population, and we're 51% of the population. So with a women's commissioner, because I know the work that the women's movement does, and you're knocking door upon door upon door, you're being put off. I relate to them, because I don't think grassroots voices are heard enough. Like, and I've spent the last 50 years reimaging my own leadership to try to fit in, to what's happening at a higher level. So, grassroots are being left behind here. And that's not down to anybody's fault. It's down to the lack of investment in grassroots. I want to talk about funding, because we need invested in, not funded. We need proper investment. And maybe if we had a commissioner for women in the north, a commissioner for women in the south,
Mhm.
that we could actually get more power of getting the things that we need put to the table where it should be.
Thank you. That's a very good question. They'll answer the panel well. Anybody else with a question?
We have questions from online.
Yeah?
Yeah, if I can read it very quickly.
Yes, can please. Yeah.
So someone said the sharing of lived experiences by Lynn and Geraldine, talking about some of the specific things they have been involved in, it just brings so much to the complexity to light. What strikes me is how to address what seems like a zero sum. If women are to gain more space, etc., then do men lose space? If power is to be dismantled, some will lose power. What language can we be using to address what will appear as a zero sum, win-lose? Thanks for fascinating discussion.
Okay, thank you. So maybe then we go back to the panel and they can try to answer. Geraldine, there was a question there for you, but any of you can answer it. The one on community level, yeah, level knowledge, yeah. And also, Lynn, you can maybe answer on that.
Yes, I think far too much is spent on consultants. And I think very often, you know, they don't know enough about the subject. I once watched a presentation about regeneration in my area. And not no offence to Scotland, but there were Scottish consultants brought in to do the consultation on what would regenerate the area I lived in. And what was hilarious was he actually put up a photograph, which was the bottom of my street, and said, well, you know, look at how bad this looks, you know. I just was dumbfounded, you know, like, so, I mean, I really think, you know, and I had to explain to him, you know, that's actually where I live. I'm insulted. I actually think I live in a good community, you know, it's a good district, you know, kind of. So anyway, I would say that there is far too much that's getting spent on it. And I would think that that money, probably you would cut a lot, you know, you save a lot of money, but that monies, and depending on what the issue is, monies would be much better put into the local community sector or voluntary sector, and who are well able to actually get the information that is required, you know, about the subject matter, and get the views of the community. I mean, we have all sorts of really good tools that we use for engaging with for community, for getting them involved, for getting their views, doing that online, offline, getting the views of older people, every segment of the community. And I think for all of that, that really should go to local community organisations, because to be honest, many of them are funded around things like people in place, and that they know what to do there. And I think also in terms of, you know, broader consultancies around like physical developments and so on, I think again the same applies. I mean, I really think that rather than just put things out to tender and have consultants writing in huge bids, it's really, I mean, I have to tell you, we did run a brilliant programme that was around supporting families who needed the support. And we got funding for a so-called 3-year pilot to run that. We had it monitored, evaluated. It was hugely successful, and government still decided to go out to tender. And, you know, that went out to tender to a range of consultants, and they won that tender, who then went and subcontracted to someone else. And you know what? I was sitting in City Council 3 years later when the people who had won that tender came in and asked us, could we save their jobs? You know, I meanwhile became a councillor. And so this whole business, you know, like is very short term. It doesn't build up local skills, local sustainability, you know, really regenerate. And I honestly think we need to be looking at those bills.
Thank you.
We do.
Yeah, that's a little bit
You were saying earlier about sharing information and transparency. That used to happen years ago, as you say, but it doesn't happen so much now. And I think it's because the the money pot has got so small that people hold on to all the knowledge that they get to try and make themselves in a better position to get the funding as it comes out. So I think funding our monies or whatever does need to be looked at, because it is a big barrier to collaborative working.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Lynn, do you have a different perspective or anything you want to add there?
I'm going to try and just do a kind of, some of them are kind of just I'm going to try and answer all of the things that were said there in a kind of way that they all kind of join up anyway. But I think even going back to the structures piece, I think it ties in with the piece on consultants, and then it ties in with the not listening to the grassroots, and you know, all of that. Like if you look at grassroots, even it was women that set up everything. If you look at the 70s, the 80s, and in Dublin, if you look at the drug services, the community centres, the summer projects, it was women who maybe couldn't work because of the marriage ban, so they were really active in their community, so they have all of that. And it was then the structures and those outside of those working class communities seeing that as a profession and said, oh, we're going to now make you have to not be the person who runs this, because you're going to now have this governance structure, and we think now you need a CEO, and now we happen to think you need to have a business degree and this master's, and we're going to push out all the local knowledge, and we're going to actually now make ourselves have jobs on the backs of the stuff that yous have been doing on yous our own for decades, right? So then it was consumed by the structures, and then the middle class and up and the professional class, let's say, came in then, and they're the ones that hire the consultants, because aren't they the ones that know the consultants that are also in that same professional space? So it's all interlinked when you go back and start kind of pulling it all apart. So for me, it's not even about tinkering with the structures. It's actually burning the structures to the ground, because they want communities to fit into structures that weren't made for us, and to just do little cosmetic changes to make it look like we're fitting into their structure and how they do things, which is neoliberal, which is about, like, let's do an assessment, there's a doubling up of work going on over there, or are they doing the same work, let's take their funding, you know, all of those questions. And the piece on the sum zero game, it's not because everyone should have a social floor, everyone should have a certain level of power, and nobody should fall beneath that. And it's in falling beneath that when you look at not having access to housing, not having access to childcare. So it's not about how much power you can build up or you can earn more, or it's about the conditions of one's environment, you know, more than saying you're going to lose power because you have the hand power over here, because it's also about how you use power. People use power positively too, to create space. So power is not this tangible necessarily thing, although it has a tangible impact in your everyday life. But you can share power in a way that your life is still not ever going to go below that social floor. Like, you've male politicians who also are barristers. You've male politicians who are also, could go back to teaching. You know, if you were to make room for other classes where being a politician would be their only job. Do you know what I mean? So you have people with multiple professions within a political space. So for them to share political power and see that maybe they should step out of that space now to make space for women or for other voices, it actually doesn't take anything away from them at all. So it's really about what we don't fall below, rather than even what you're giving up once you're kind of above that floor, in a sense. Do you know what I mean? But again, everything is completely, it all connects together. Do you know what I mean? But also NGOs, we need middle class men and women to stop taking up roles of CEOs and working class communities, and we need to look within the communities to actually, because there's so many amazing people who are not getting jobs because they won't articulate in a way that interview panel thinks is appropriate for them to have that job, yet they're doing that job anyway every day in their community, and they've more credibility in the community anyway.
They do, yeah. You're very actually right. And if just to finish with you, you know, on the Women Commission that was suggested by Mary there, one from the north, one from the south, what's your perspective or views on that?
I fear I'm just gonna repeat what you said, but I think for me, I try to think of like feminist leadership and feminist politics as like this two-pronged thing. So like there's the utopian one where it's like we burn it all to the ground, you know, Fanon style radical reconstruction. And then there's the like, well, you know, there's women today that need justice for, you know, domestic abuse. We need change. Like we can't just wait for some kind of like savior to come along and change everything, right? So, you know, we're not evangelicals. So so I think that we should keep in the back of our minds like what we want the world to look like, which is decolonial, anti-capitalist, you know, and these things are all products of that, like you were saying, cronyism, like nepotism, these are all products of like this colonial capitalist structure that we have. So we're going to get rid of that. But in the meantime, I think the way to get there is like, you know, as we're saying, increase women in leadership. So quotas, I think reserved seats are a great idea. It is crazy to me that the traveling community, which is such an important part of like the island of Ireland, like don't have reserved seats in in either chamber in the north or the south. And deliberative democracy. Emma's done some good work on that, and Joanne was talking about it. Get women like from the grassroots involved in politics. Obviously, like the work that 50 Day and I do, I think there should be more of that, like giving women the confidence and things like that. And then what you were saying, the material conditions, right? Women shouldn't be living in a cost of living crisis. If you're constantly worried about feeding your kids, you don't have the time or the energy to think about changing more substantial things. And so from that, I think women's commissioner, like my gut reaction is to be like, no, like it's not going to help. It's just going to be liberal. It's just going to like desanitize, depoliticize everything. But at the same time, it might practically be helpful, right? But for me, yes, a women's commissioner, it could work. But so many of women's issues are not just women's issues. They're class issues, they're race issues, they're migration status issues, they're queer issues, right? So it kind of having like Irish language commissioner, women's commissioner, maybe like an LGBT commissioner, like that's all well and good, but you're kind of repeating these neoliberal things where like we put everybody in a box and we tell them we can't work together because you don't understand each other, which is a myth, right? That's not true. So I would say like yes, but with nuance, you know? And then the zero-sum game thing, I mean, I think viewing this all as a zero-sum game is literally fundamentally the problem. If no one is losing anything, we are only gaining from having more diversity.
That exactly it. And I actually just wanted to finish with that point of view that, you know, as feminists, when we talk about feminist leadership, it's not replacing one with another, you know, whether it's replacing men, replacing them from a class, you know, and all that. That's not what I would see myself. I'm speaking from my own perspective. It's actually looking at the governance and how things are done, you know, and really like, you know, looking into the control that is there, how things are controlled, rather than controlling, how do we care for everyone living in our society or in our country? And in that, having no competition, because like, you know, politics is like, and these positions of leadership, they are made like competition. People are competing. And mainly you see these relations of power, you know, working a lot in place, you know, when, you know, things are happening, even in terms of making decisions, whether it's the issue of childcare, which the National Women Council have been championing, you know, and men taking more responsibility on care responsibility. We don't even want to go to the unpaid care work that women are doing, all of us do every time. But really acknowledging that and actually, you know, taking that, you know, as something positive that people are doing and including women in levels of decision making so that they can bring this perspective of what they are, you know, seeing on the ground. So rather than competing, to collaborate more, if more men can agree to collaborate more with women, to see, you know, where they're coming them and their perspective, being for the fact that, you know, as people who are the one who are, as people who are in charge of our families most of the time, and I mean this especially for people who have children, quite often, you know, we are the one who are struggling with these children, with the absence of men, and I'm talking about this from a migrant perspective, where we have absent fathers, you know, and you'll find women taking care of children who then end up in difficult situations, whether it's drugs or money wars, you know, they're involved in things that they would have not involved in if the responsibility was shared equally and everybody actually help with that. You know, that whole issue of exclusion and, you know, inclusion, ensuring that we are not leaving anyone behind. And the whole issue of intersectionality is very, very important here. So we need a civil culture where every woman, north, south, urban, rural, because we did hear of West and South as well, migrant women, travelers women, Roma women, and for sure we leave some women behind, you know. So we have to ensure that we don't leave any women behind. And how we work on that, we have to be very smart. You know, we have to ensure that all of us have a seat on that table, whether it's not even just sitting here, but also bringing the perspective of women who are not on this table as well and representing it that way. So I would really like to thank my wonderful panel. I'm sure you would have liked them to continue. Okay. So Joanna, Geraldine, Lane, and Aoife, thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thanks, and thanks to you, Salome, as well. And I want to really thank the people online for staying with us as well. I know I got some messages on my phone saying people were really enjoying the conversation and just felt it was just really rich in terms of what was being discussed. So big thank you to those online, because I know that piece of the day is now finishing. We're going to move to lunch now, but just before I do, if there's any members of the forum who won't be staying after lunch, if you maybe could have a chat with Donal, Liliana or Angela, who's here, just in terms of the evaluation of the forum, because we'd really like people to be a part of that and to fill it in. So I know we've ran over time and we did say an hour for lunch, but if it was okay, are people happy to still come back at 1 and to take 30 minutes? Is that okay? Brilliant. So, okay, so we're back here at 1 and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not leaving for anything. I have a good